A quiet street turned into the site of a tragedy that shocked the nation. A decorated Black U.S. Army general, a woman who had dedicated her life to serving her country, was stopped by a racist cop for no reason. What started as a simple encounter quickly spiraled into something far worse. The officer's bias and anger led to an unthinkable act. He killed the general in cold blood. But the story doesn't end there. Her son, who had always admired his mother's strength and courage, arrives on the scene. What happens next is nothing short of justice in its most unexpected form. You won't believe how karma comes back to haunt the officer. Before we dive into the full story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this, because this is a story the world needs to hear. Stay tuned. It only gets more intense. General Angela Roberts was a respected U.S. Army officer. She had spent her life serving her country, earning medals and respect for her bravery and leadership. Despite her achievements, she was humble and believed that true strength came from serving others. She was also a proud mother to her son Marcus, who saw her as a hero and role model. On the day it happened, Angela had just finished speaking to a group of young cadets about hard work and discipline. Wearing her uniform, she stopped in a quiet, suburban street to pick up a gift for Marcus. The area was peaceful, with small shops and tree-lined sidewalks. Officer Darren Cooper was patrolling nearby. Darren had been a cop for years, but his attitude was shaped by bias. He often judged people by how they looked instead of what they did. When he saw Angela, her confident presence in uniform upset him. He immediately assumed she didn't belong. Angela walked out of the store holding a small wrapped gift when Darren called out to her. "Hey," he said sharply, stepping out of his car. Angela turned calmly to face him. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked politely. "You don't look like you belong around here," Darren said, his tone cold. Angela stayed calm and replied, "I'm picking up a gift for my son. Is that an issue?" But Darren wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. The quiet street grew tense, setting the stage for a confrontation no one could have expected. The quiet street grew tense as Officer Darren Cooper stood face to face with General Angela Roberts. Her uniform, which symbolized years of service to her country, didn't seem to matter to Darren. His eyes were filled with suspicion, fueled by his own bias. "Let me see your ID," Darren demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. Angela raised her head slightly, her expression calm but firm. "Why do you need to see my ID, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." Darren narrowed his eyes. "You're acting suspicious. People like you think you can go anywhere and do whatever you want." Angela's calm demeanor shifted. "People like me?" she asked, her voice steady but serious. "Officer, I am General Angela Roberts of the U.S. Army. I've spent my life serving this country, and I have done nothing to deserve this treatment." Her words didn't stop Darren. Instead, they made him angrier. "I don't care who you are," he snapped. "If you don't show me your ID right now, I'll have to take further action." Angela took a deep breath, keeping her composure. "This is unnecessary. I parked legally, walked into a store, and bought a gift for my son. There is no law I've broken, and you know it." By now, a few people in the area had started noticing the confrontation. A man nearby whispered to his friend, "What's going on over there?" Another person began recording with their phone, sensing that something wasn't right. Darren stepped closer, his hand on his belt, put the bag down, and stepped toward the car. He barked. Angela didn't move. "You're abusing your authority," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable strength in her words. Darren's frustration boiled over. "You're resisting an officer's orders. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Angela stood tall, refusing to be intimidated. "This isn't resistance," she said firmly. "This is me standing up for myself. What you're doing is wrong." Darren grabbed for Angela's arm, pulling her roughly. She stumbled, but caught herself, standing straight again. "Don't touch me," she warned, her voice steady. The small crowd that had gathered started murmuring loudly. One bystander shouted, "Hey, leave her alone. She hasn't done anything wrong." Another person added, "She's in a military uniform. What's your problem?" But Darren ignored the crowd. His anger blinded him to the situation. "Get on the ground," he yelled, pulling out his taser. Angela's heart raced, but she didn't move. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice unwavering despite the fear in her eyes. "You'll regret this." Without hesitation, Darren fired the taser. Angela cried out and fell to the ground as the crowd gasped in horror. People shouted angrily, their voices filled with disbelief. "She's a general!" someone yelled. "She didn't do anything." Angela struggled to sit up, her breathing heavy and labored. She locked eyes with Darren, her voice quiet but firm. "You don't know what you've just done," she said. Darren didn't respond. He placed handcuffs on her wrists, ignoring the protests of the growing crowd. The bystander recording stepped closer, shouting, "This is wrong. Everyone's going to see what you did." As Angela lay on the ground, sirens filled the air. Another patrol car pulled up, but before the officers inside could react, a black SUV screeched to a stop nearby. The door opened, and a tall man stepped out. It was Marcus, Angela's son. His eyes widened in shock as he saw his mother handcuffed and hurt on the pavement. His expression quickly turned to one of anger and determination. The crowd parted as Marcus walked toward the scene, his presence commanding and intense. His suit and military badge revealed that he was someone important, though most didn't yet know who he was. "What's going on here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but cold. He looked at Darren with piercing eyes. Darren hesitated for the first time, sensing the shift in the air. "This doesn't concern you," Darren said, his tone defensive. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "It concerns me when my mother, a U.S. Army general, is lying handcuffed on the ground." Darren froze, his eyes darting between Marcus and Angela. For the first time he realized the weight of what he had done. The crowd, now completely focused on Marcus, began whispering to each other. "That's her son," one person said. "He looks like someone powerful." Angela, still on the ground, raised her head slightly and looked at Marcus. "It's okay," she said softly. "Let's handle this the right way." Marcus nodded, but the fire in his eyes didn't fade. He turned back to Darren. "You have no idea who you've just hurt, but you're about to find out." The tension in the air was thick as Marcus stood over Darren, the crowd waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was so thick it was almost suffocating. Marcus, standing tall in his formal suit with a military badge on his chest, locked eyes with Officer Darren Cooper. The crowd, now larger and more vocal, watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. "Let my mother go," Marcus said firmly, his voice calm but filled with authority. Darren hesitated, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. "She resisted arrest," he stammered, his tone defensive. "She refused to follow my orders." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Resisted arrest?" he repeated, his voice colder. "You tasered a decorated U.S. Army general who was doing absolutely nothing wrong. That's not resistance. That's your ego and bias in action." Darren took a step back, his hand still resting on his belt. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered, trying to defend himself. "You didn't care to know," Marcus shot back. "You didn't even try to listen to her. You saw her, made assumptions, and acted on them. That's the problem." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger evident. "He's right," someone shouted. "She didn't do anything," another voice added. "How many others has this cop treated like this?" Angela, still handcuffed on the ground, raised her head slightly. "Marcus," she said softly, "let's keep this calm." Marcus glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment before he turned back to Darren. "Calm? After what he's done?" he said, his voice heavy with frustration. But he took a deep breath, reining in his anger. "Fine. Let's do this the right way." He gestured toward the second patrol car that had arrived moments earlier. The officers standing by looked nervous, but attentive. "Uncuff her. Now," Marcus ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Darren hesitated, his pride clashing with the reality of the situation. "She resisted," he repeated weakly, but the words held no weight. One of the other officers stepped forward and unlocked Angela's handcuffs. The crowd erupted into cheers as Angela slowly stood up, brushing off her uniform. Her face showed pain, but also dignity, her composure unshaken. Angela looked Darren in the eye. "You've disgraced your badge today," she said quietly. "Not just with me, but with everyone here who trusted you to do your job fairly." Darren opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand. "Don't," he said firmly. "You've already done enough." The crowd began to chant, their voices growing louder. "Accountability now!" someone yelled. Others echoed the demand. Phones were still recording, capturing every second of what had become a public spectacle. Darren looked around, his face pale as he realized the full scope of the situation. The weight of the cameras, the angry crowd, and the stern faces of Marcus and Angela pressed down on him like a storm. Marcus stepped closer to Darren, his voice low but firm. "Do you know who my mother is?" he asked. "She's a general who served this country with honor and bravery. She's sacrificed more than you could imagine to protect people, including people like you." Darren swallowed hard, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Marcus continued, "And do you know who I am? I work with the Secretary of Defense. I represent the very system you swore to uphold when you put on that badge. Today, you've betrayed it." The words hit Darren like a hammer. His head dropped, and his shoulders slumped. "I didn't know," he muttered again, but the excuse felt hollow even to him. Angela stepped forward, her voice calm but filled with strength. "This isn't just about me, officer. It's about how many others you've treated this way. How many people have suffered because you acted on assumptions instead of facts." The crowd clapped and cheered in agreement. Someone shouted, "She's right. This has to stop." Darren looked at Angela, his face showing regret for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, but the apology felt too little, too late. Marcus stared at him for a long moment before stepping back. "You'll have plenty of time to think about your actions," he said, "because this isn't over. There will be consequences." Angela nodded, placing a hand gently on her son's shoulder. "Marcus, let's go," she said softly. Marcus took a deep breath and turned to the crowd. "Thank you all for standing here and speaking out," he said. "Your voices matter. Keep using them to demand accountability." The crowd cheered louder as Marcus helped Angela into the SUV. The cameras continued to roll as they drove away, leaving Darren standing alone, surrounded by the weight of his actions and the echoes of the crowd's demands. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the beginning of Darren's reckoning. The echoes of the crowd's chants faded into the background as Darren stood frozen in place, watching Angela and Marcus leave in the black SUV. His heart raced, and his mind struggled to process the weight of the situation. He had assumed that Angela was just another civilian he could intimidate, but the truth was far from what he expected. The viral video of the confrontation spread rapidly. Within hours, Millions had seen Darren's actions, yelling at a decorated U.S. Army general, tasering her, and dragging her to the ground. The backlash was immediate and fierce. News outlets picked up the story, sharing Angela's impressive background. A woman who had served in war zones, led countless troops, and received some of the highest honors in the military. Darren sat in the station's locker room staring blankly at his phone. The video played on a loop in his mind, each frame reminding him of his mistakes. Headlines like "Racist Cop Attacks, Black Army General," and "Decorated Military Hero Humiliated by Police" filled every news feed. Comments poured in. How could this happen to someone like her? This officer shouldn't have a badge. What about the people who don't have her status? What happens to them? Darren's stomach churned. He wasn't just facing public outrage. He was under investigation by his own department. The chief of police had called him into his office earlier, his tone icy. "We're not just dealing with a mistake, Darren. This is a disgrace. We've opened a formal review, and I suggest you prepare yourself." The consequences Darren feared came faster than he anticipated. That evening, a press conference was held. Marcus stood at the podium, flanked by Angela and several other high-ranking officials. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed the incident. "What happened to my mother is unacceptable. It's not just a failure by one officer, it's a failure of the system that allows bias to dictate actions instead of facts." The room was silent as Marcus continued. "My mother, General Angela Roberts, has spent her entire life serving this country. She's fought for freedom, justice, and the rights of all citizens, regardless of who they are. But yesterday, she was treated as if her life didn't matter. This isn't just an insult to her, it's an insult to the values she fought to protect." Angela stepped forward, her presence commanding. "I've faced challenges on the battlefield, but nothing prepares you for the pain of being judged unfairly," she said. "I want to make it clear. This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." The crowd erupted in applause, their support overwhelming. Journalists shouted questions, but Marcus and Angela walked off the stage, leaving the world to digest their powerful words. Back at the station, Darren felt the full weight of their statements. His fellow officers avoided him, their glances filled with judgment. Officer Lopez, his partner from earlier, finally approached him. "Darren, this isn't just going to blow over," she said quietly. "You need to take responsibility." Darren looked up at her, his face pale. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I didn't know who she was." "You didn't care to find out," Lopez replied bluntly. "That's the problem. You let your assumptions guide you. And now the whole world is watching." Lopez's words stayed with Darren. He couldn't escape the growing pressure. The video of the incident had sparked protests outside the station, with signs reading, "Justice for Angela," and "Stop Racial Bias in Policing." Community leaders demanded his termination, while social media users flooded his accounts with criticism. Meanwhile, Marcus and Angela worked behind the scenes to push for change. They met with government officials, police reform advocates, and military leaders, using Angela's story as a call for action. Their efforts led to national attention, sparking debates about bias in law enforcement and the treatment of minorities, even those with high ranks and titles. One of the most surprising twists came when Marcus revealed his position. He wasn't just a government official. He was a high-ranking advisor to the Secretary of Defense, responsible for overseeing national security and military policies. The revelation shocked many, adding even more weight to their fight for justice. Darren, who had assumed Marcus was just another angry bystander, now realized he had confronted someone with immense influence. A meeting was called at the police department, with Angela and Marcus invited to address the officers. Darren sat in the back of the room, his hands clenched tightly. Angela's voice was calm but firm as she addressed the group. Bias doesn't just harm individuals, it destroys trust in the system. When you wear this badge, you have a responsibility to protect everyone, not just those who look like you or meet your expectations. Her words hit Darren hard. He thought about how easily he had dismissed her, not because of anything she had done, but because of how she looked. He realized that his actions weren't just mistakes, they were part of a larger problem. After the meeting, Darren approached Angela and Marcus. His voice was low and hesitant. "General Roberts, Mr. Roberts," he began, "I want to apologize. I acted out of bias and I didn't listen. I made assumptions, and I was wrong." Angela looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Apologies are a start," she said, "but they're not enough. What are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Darren swallowed hard. "I've already started bias training, and I'm stepping away from my position. I need to reflect on what I've done and work to fix the harm I've caused." Marcus nodded, his voice firm. "Accountability matters. I hope you're serious about change, because this isn't just about you. It's about the people who trusted you to serve and protect them." Angela added, "True change comes from consistent action. I hope you'll use this experience to grow, not to run from the truth." Darren nodded, his face filled with regret. "I will," he said quietly. The aftermath of the incident rippled far beyond the police department. Angela and Marcus's efforts led to new policies aimed at reducing bias in policing, including mandatory training, community oversight committees, and better accountability measures. Their story became a rallying cry for justice and fairness, inspiring others to speak out against injustice. As Darren watched their progress from a distance, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his actions. The consequences were harsh, but they were deserved. For Angela and Marcus, the fight wasn't just about one incident. It was about creating a system where no one else would have to endure what they had. In the end, Darren's downfall wasn't just a punishment. It was a lesson, a turning point for a system long overdue for change. The fallout from the incident involving General Angela Roberts and Officer Darren Cooper continued to grow, sparking national outrage. Protests erupted across the country, with people demanding accountability for law enforcement officers and systemic changes to prevent bias. Signs that read, "Justice for Angela" and "End Racism in Policing" filled streets, parks, and social media feeds. Darren, suspended from the police force and under investigation, spent his days reflecting on his actions. He couldn't escape the images from that day. Angela on the ground, her uniform representing years of service, and Marcus standing tall, a son protecting his mother. The public had turned against him, but it was the personal shame that weighed the heaviest. "How did I let it come to this?" he muttered to himself. At the same time, Angela and Marcus continued their work. They refused to let the incident be just another viral story. Angela took the opportunity to speak at community events, schools, and military bases, sharing her experience and the importance of justice and respect. "This isn't just about me," she said in a speech that was broadcast nationwide. "It's about creating a system where everyone is treated with dignity, no matter who they are." Marcus worked closely with lawmakers and activists, pushing for reforms that would improve accountability within police departments. One of his biggest achievements was helping to pass a bill requiring mandatory bias training and oversight committees in every precinct. "Real change starts with accountability," he said during a press conference. "This isn't just about punishing one officer. It's about fixing a system that allowed this to happen. Darren's story, however, didn't end with his suspension. Angela and Marcus had made it clear that they didn't want revenge. They wanted growth and understanding. Darren, inspired by their words, enrolled in a restorative justice program. He met with Angela and Marcus privately, not to defend himself, but to listen. During their meeting, Darren sat across from Angela, his hands trembling slightly. "General Roberts," he began, his voice low, "I know I can't undo what I did. I treated you with disrespect and acted out of bias. I'm ashamed of my actions, and I'm sorry." Angela studied him for a moment before responding. "Officer Cooper, acknowledging your actions is a step in the right direction, but apologies are just words. What matters is what you do from here." Marcus added, "You have a chance to learn and grow, but only if you take responsibility, not just for what you did to my mother, but for how you've treated others." Darren nodded. "I'm committed to doing better. I've started bias training, and I've been volunteering with a community organization to rebuild trust. It's not enough, but I'm trying." Angela's voice softened slightly. "Change is never easy, Officer Cooper, but it's necessary. I hope you'll continue to reflect on this and use your experience to educate others." The meeting left Darren with a sense of purpose, though the road ahead was long. He knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but he was determined to do the work. The impact of the incident reached far beyond Darren's personal journey. Communities across the nation rallied together, inspired by Angela and Marcus's message. Police departments began implementing reforms, and new policies aimed at preventing bias were introduced. Angela's courage and Marcus's determination became a symbol of hope and resilience, reminding everyone of the power of standing up against injustice. One of the most powerful moments came when Angela was invited to speak at a national summit on justice and equality. She stood on the stage, her uniform crisp and her voice steady. "I didn't ask for this experience," she said, "but I believe it happened for a reason. It reminded me that even when we think progress has been made, there is still work to do. We cannot rest until every person is treated with respect and dignity." The audience gave her a standing ovation, moved by her words and the strength she displayed. Marcus, sitting in the front row, felt a deep sense of pride. His mother's resilience had turned a painful moment into a powerful call for change. As the weeks turned into months, the story of Angela Roberts remained a beacon of hope. Communities continued to push for reforms. Activists found renewed energy in their fight for equality, and people across the country were reminded of the importance of standing up for what's right. For Angela, the incident was a reminder of her purpose, not just as a general, but as a leader, a mother, and an advocate for justice. For Marcus, it was a lesson in resilience and the power of using one's voice to create change. And for Darren, it was the beginning of a long journey of reflection and growth. He knew he would never forget the mistake he made that day, but he hoped it would serve as a reminder to others. Assumptions can destroy lives, but accountability and understanding can help rebuild them. The ripple effects of that day in the quiet suburban street were felt far and wide. It wasn't just about one officer or one general. It was about a system and the people fighting to make it better. Angela's story became a reminder that even in the face of injustice, dignity and courage can inspire change. Angela Roberts' story was more than just a personal tragedy. It became a moment of awakening for many. It highlighted how bias can harm even the most honorable among us, and sparked important conversations about justice and accountability. Her strength, along with Marcus's determination, turned an act of injustice into a powerful call for change. This isn't just a story about one officer's actions. It's a reminder that bias, unchecked, can lead to devastating consequences. But it's also a story of resilience, leadership, and hope. Angela's dignity and Marcus's fight for reform remind us all that real change begins with each of us taking responsibility and standing up for what is right. Now, it's your turn to reflect. If you were in Angela's place, or even in the crowd, how would you have reacted? What steps can we take as individuals to create a fairer and more just society? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this story, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us of the power of justice. Thank you for being part of this conversation. And remember, change starts with all of us. We'll see you in the next story. Stay safe, stay aware, and keep standing up for what's right.